afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for that introduction. And thank you for coming to the graveyard shift. I know the lunch hour makes all of us very tired, so I'm glad that all of you came here to join us in this panel. I'm also really sorry that Adebayo Olukoshi could not be with us because of the topic of his presentation, but I'm very excited to be on the same panel with Andrew Fisher, who is from ISS, the school that made me a development studies person. I'm forever grateful to the ISS for my years there. My presentation is titled Gender Equitable and Transformative Social Policy for Africa's Development, Elements of an Agenda for Change. And I'll leave you to judge how much of an agenda for change this will be. But it's something that I really wanted to talk about because as a non-economist in a meeting of economists, I feel very strongly that a discussion of social policy would be a very good thing to have, particularly because one is dealing with heterodox economists. I think from our presentations, from the presentations this morning, we all see very clearly that structural transformation and sustainable development goals have become a legitimate agenda for development in Africa. Also, we have experienced the COVID-19 pandemic, and everyone has commented that this pandemic has become a spoiler. It basically is affecting the agenda of sustainable development and also of structural transformation because it has contracted economies, it has exposed the inadequacies of economic and social infrastructures for development. And in Africa, the African Development Bank says that it puts 30 million people in Africa in extreme poverty in 2021. And an additional 1.8 million will become extremely poor in 2022, and another 2.1 million in 2023 because of the Russia-Ukraine war. These are grim figures, but at the same time, they actually understate the existential crisis that people are facing. We all know the limitations of income poverty measurements for actually capturing the multidimensional nature of poverty. Also, these statistics do not tell us about the high levels of underemployment and precarious work that we see at the moment in Africa. But we do experience on an everyday basis that the majority of working people are in existential crisis. There are growing class, gender, and geographical inequalities, and this has affected many social development indicators. We also are experiencing another debt crisis. A study by the ADB showed that in 2020, the average debt to GDP ratio of African countries was about 71.4%, and that 12 out of 36 countries which had been studied showed that the public external debt had doubled in the space of 5 years, rising from a cumulative stock of 89 billion at the end of 2015 to 191 billion at the end of 2020. And the largest increases are in Angola, Kenya, Cote d'Ivoire, and Cameroon. Several other debt-distressed countries are on the brink of default, and my own country, Ghana, is a good example. The increase in public debt has been accompanied by the rise in its cost because of the high proportion of private lenders. And there's been a savage development of devaluation of currencies in many African countries, and rising interest rates, galloping food prices. The food prices situation is particularly worrisome because it has generational effects. This period of food insecurity is likely to affect millions of young children into their adulthood. We also are experiencing a high cost of essential goods and services, energy, education, health, and transportation. for me has been most disturbing about the crisis is the focus on short-term solutions. So basically, governments are instituting taxes and regressive and excessive taxation to deal with the problem. Recently in Ghana, the government issued a 1.5% tax on the transfer amount of all electronic transactions, and this was creating a lot of heartache. We also see the move to go back to the IMF. Again, in Ghana, it was shocking to me to realize that people were actually very happy that the IMF was coming back because they felt that it would control government corruption and incompetence. We also see massive increases in interest rates on government bonds and papers. And what's sad about it is also the lack of discussion about the roots of the crisis or alternatives. Nobody is talking much about the agrarian stagnation, the fluctuating commodity prices, the problematic structural transformation that many African countries have experienced, the fact that many of them have services that have outgrown the agrarian sector, but are services which are low capital and the refuge of the informal economy. We also are not talking about the structure of the labor force, the fact that it is mostly informal and there are so many people who are underemployed and are in precarious work. So for me, this is a very timely and important conference, and I really want to appreciate the organizers of the conference for giving us the opportunity to talk about alternatives. I was very happy that throughout this morning we've been talking about alternatives and beginning to debate them. So what I want to contribute to this discussion is to examine how the relationship between economic and social policy has been problematic for addressing the crisis we are facing at the moment, and therefore how to reorient this relationship so that Africa can be transformed into a continent of prosperous, secure, healthy, and just societies. My approach to this is, one, to affirm the importance of social reproduction. The speaker before lunch also talked about the importance of social reproduction, but also to affirm the calls for transformative social policy. In that wise, I want to do two things. I want to discuss some of the factors that hamper structural transformation in Africa, and also what structural transformation or what transformative social policy implies concretely for economic and social policies. I just want to start by presenting how one is defining social policy. In Kandarire in 2011 defined social policy as the collective interventions to directly affect social welfare, social institutions, and social relations. For me, this is very important. It's not just about social welfare, it's also to affect social institutions and social relations. It's concerned with the redistributive effects of economic policy, the protection of people from the vagaries of the market and the changing circumstances of age, the enhancement of the productive potential of members of society, and the reconciliation of the burden of reproduction with that of other social tasks. He goes on to say that successful societies have given social policies all these tasks, although the weighting of tasks has varied among countries and within each country from period to period. So one might ask, in what sense is social policy transformative? This broader definition of social policy is transformative because it has both intrinsic or normative values such as inclusion, equity, and solidarity, but it also has instrumental value because it's been given four functions. Secondly, it guides both social and economic dimensions of development, if we go back to the definition. Lastly, it also provides a glue that holds society together. So it has a function of supporting social integration, and it has the potential to fundamentally alter social provisioning, transform unjust social relations, and reshape unequal relations of class, gender, race, caste, and spatial inequalities. And it also has the capacity to effect structural changes in the economy, in social relations and social institutions. which are intended to expand and deepen human welfare. So basically, if social policy has the capacity to do all these things, I'm interested in what exactly is hampering its ability to actually play this dynamic and catalytic role in development. And I'd like to point to 3 historic developments. The first one is the weakening of the commitment to the social question in the early post-colonial period. Scholars of the early post-colonial period have made the point that the focus on the national question and nation building, which effectively was about deracializing and indigenizing key positions of privilege and power, actually left the majority of Africans behind. Secondly, it was accompanied by a linear view of history, which posited that social equality could only be achieved at a much higher level of development under conditions of industrialization. And lastly, framed the development agenda itself as a trade-off or a sequencing act between development and social equality. The second historical factor is the neoliberal revolution of the 1980s. And what this did was effect a sharp separation between economic and social development. It narrowed the remit of economic development to economic growth. It relegated social policy to a limited set of measures to fix the fallout of economic growth policies. It established a paradigm shift from the idea of the economy as socially embedded and markets as social institutions. And on the ground, it abandoned the social question altogether. An important aspect of these historical factors is my third one, and that's what I call the response to the woman question. Basically, the productivist logic of the modernization ideology which powered the early post-colonial period failed to appreciate that reproductive subsidies were enjoyed by market production within extroverted capitalism, and failed to see that this was entrenching inequalities in African societies. Even with the adoption of the wid and guard approaches of the late 1960s, whilst there was sympathy to women, there was a failure to see women as economic actors. They basically were seen mostly as mothers who should be the subject of welfare because they were looking after children. And although there were some progressive social policies after independence, including the expansion in basic education, primary health care, infrastructure, and so on, which benefited girls and women, it failed to interrogate the male breadwinner model of the family, which had been imposed on African economies by colonialism, and more generally, it failed to interrogate gender inequalities and their intersections with other axes of inequality. And whilst progress was being made, it was constantly being challenged and disorganized by patriarchal ideologies, institutions, and resistance. In the 1980s, there was a recognition of women's contribution to production. But this was mainly about productivity. There was not an interest in questions of reproduction and redistribution. And many projects were agonizing all the time about how to increase women's productivity so they could increase their income. And from the 1980s, we also know that social protection, represented by cash transfers, fee exemptions for pregnant women, and credit programs, were giving some support to the welfare of women and other social groups facing existential challenges. However, the free market orientation of these policies, their narrow focus on poverty, only the poor, failed to position social policy as an emancipatory force and a catalyst for structural transformation and equitable development. Many social protection measures, as well as the wage guard approaches, therefore tended to reinforce gender inequalities. And many times, the conditionalities they set for women require them to assume normative expectations of filial, maternal, and marital piety, selflessness and hard work, accept extra responsibilities, insist that they work within groups, and also basically police them. They were subject to intrusive institutional policing, particularly around the cash transfers. Very few measures were taken to address key issues of gender equality, and some of these are women's predominant responsibility for reproductive work, the gender segmentation of work, the gender pay gap, and the gender assets gap. Also, gender-based physical and psychological violence, and last but not least, the paternalistic and discriminatory character of many social policy institutions such as marriage, land tenure, inheritance, and labor relations. So this basically is the problem of economic and social policy today. And I want to move now into the discussion about what we should be thinking about. And I just have a few short points about some of the things that we should be doing to change the way social and economic policies operate in this context. The first one is the reframing of the social question. So from a preoccupation with the productivity of workers, which many branches of economics suffer from, we really should simultaneously promote production and reproduction, as well as redistribution, protection, and social cohesion in societies and economies. If you remember, I was making the point that transformative social policies need to promote all these functions of social policy. It also needs, the social question also has to be framed with the understanding that African countries are largely agrarian, informal, with mostly self-employed persons, where work is gender segmented and results in substantive gender and other inequalities, so as to enable structural transformation in a gender equitable society. The second point, which I had been hoping that Adebayo Olukoshi would talk about, would be the reconstitution of developmental states. We also have recent experiences of developmental states in Ethiopia and Rwanda, and they offer many lessons to us about the possibilities and limitations and the challenges of developmental states. And I think we really need to reconstitute developmental states with those lessons in mind. The third, I think, has to do with recalibrating the relationship between economic and social policies, in recognition of the fact that the economy is actually part of society and markets are social institutions, and that value is created by labor. This implies that we reprioritize social reproduction. Marx talked about this morning, and basically move our emphasis on productivity in both economic and social policy, and rather focus much more on social reproduction. And this is not to say productivity is not important, but it should be seen as a means to progressive social reproduction. It also importantly, we need to address the gender wage gap and the assets gap through education, employment, and affirmative action policies. We need also to recognize and expand the compensation for reproductive roles of women, including paid maternity leave, irrespective of employment status. This is a very important part of recognizing and valuing social reproduction. Another issue has to do with financing social policy. It's very clear that the current model is unsustainable, it's too donor dependent. It is important to reduce this to the barest minimum, institute progressive taxes, special funds, and a range of domestic resource mobilization strategies and cost-effective measures. And also, it's very important to remove the conditions that depress social movements. We seem to be in this strange bind where social movements are more needed than ever, and yet many of them are demobilized by the years of repression and the nature of the crisis that we find ourselves. I want to draw attention to I want to draw attention to some of the economic policies that can address gender and other social inequalities, which are most needed at this point. One of them is the investment in public goods and services, particularly those that support the care economy. This involves an approach to public goods and services that understands them as a political choice rather than something immanent. Sometimes when people talk about public goods, it's like some things can never become public goods. But for something to become a public good, I think it's society that needs to determine that this thing is so important that we see it as a public good. The second one has to do with the prioritization of sectors that are likely to have the broadest impacts. So we should be interested in agrarian transition and agro-based industrialization. We should be interested in repairing the broken agri-food systems. And this involves using measures and policies such as subsidies, land and labor reforms, and agricultural intensification. The third has to do with reorienting economic policies on taxation, fiscal policies, monetary policies, and so on. These too often are seen as the holy grail, which are not subject to change. But we should be asking ourselves how to deal with inflation and currency fluctuations, which avoid further immiseration of the working people. So in conclusion, I've basically been saying that without structural transformation, Africa's economic and social problems cannot be addressed. And without economic and social policies working in tandem as equal partners, structural transformation is not possible. And thirdly, that both economic and social policies need to prioritize social reproduction and tackle inequalities, especially those created by the intersection of class, gender, and spatial inequalities. We also need stronger social movements and developmental states to oversee this change. And I believe that every conversation is a step towards these momentous changes. Thank you very much.